If I were to ask you what one ingredient is in pretty much every cocktail that's ever been made, the answer of course would be water. So just like in the coffee industry, when I think a lot of people underestimate the power of water, even though it makes up a massive proportion of the drink, I think in the drinks industry, water in the form of ice, dilution, and occasionally hot water in hot drinks is often massively overlooked, even though it has a fundamental impact on things like the temperature of the drink, but also the taste and the texture. So today I'm going to run through my top tips when it comes to ice and dilution so that we can make the best possible drinks every single time. So the first thing I want to talk about, which is really important, is the quality and consistency of the ice. And before we even have ice, obviously we have water. The water wants to be neutral tasting without any kind of chlorine flavors or metallic flavors. It wants to be the water you'd be happy to drink fundamentally because you're going to. We're going to freeze this into consistent cubes and ideally have an ice tray that you use repeatedly. I've got 4 or 5 of these, which means I always have the same size ice cubes for shaking, and I always use 8 cubes when I shake a cocktail. And I also have these bigger cubes, which I use for serving drinks over, giving a little bit more surface area and a slower dilution, because I want the drink that you serve over ice to take a much longer time to dilute, so you've got more time to drink it. So consistency-wise, the same ice, the same amount of ice. Ideally, it wants to come straight out the freezer like these. And you can see with these ice cubes, they're really nice and firm. They haven't started to melt, which is really important. And we're going to be using these straight away so we can really control the dilution. If we're going to be using ice that's been sitting out for maybe 15, 20, 25 minutes, obviously it'd start to melt, it'd start to round off at the edges. It'd lose this kind of dry look and we get much more water introduced to the drink straight away. So as soon as you add the wet ice into the drink, it immediately starts diluting, the clock starts ticking. And with wet ice that's started to melt, you really won't get the drink down to the temperature you want to, but more importantly, shake it to the texture you want before the drink becomes over diluted. So the first tip I'll give here is to use the same really high quality ice made with neutral, delicious tasting water. Use the same amount, same size, same shape in every cocktail. That way, whichever drink you make is completely repeatable and easy to control the dilution. So number 2 is probably something a little bit less obvious, and that's to measure your dilution, particularly when you first get started making cocktails. And by doing this, you really understand how much water you're introducing to your drinks, which otherwise you wouldn't be able to do. So the process for this is really easy. Add your glass to some scales, tear the scales, add all your ingredients to the drink so you know exactly how much the ingredients weigh before dilution. Add the ice, stir it down or shake it up. Then pop your serving glass onto the same scales, tear them off, and pour the liquid into the glass, measuring how much you end up with. In the case of this drink, this started off as being just under 70 grams, and after stirring, ended up being just over 90 grams, meaning we added just over 20 grams of water, which equates to around about 30% dilution. So measuring this gives you a really good control over how much water you're adding, and you start to understand exactly how much time it takes to add how much water. And one thing you need to think here is any less than 20% is going to be really kind of low dilution, giving big boozy flavors and allowing those spirits to come through. Anything over 40% is going to be quite watered down, but again, you need to think about the ABV of the ingredients in the drink, and that 20 to 40 is probably a sweet spot that most people will enjoy, but not everyone. So make sure you understand where you are in terms of dilution so you can tailor the drinks either to yourself or whoever you're serving them to. So the final point here is a really important one, and it's to be intentional. So what I mean by this is to make sure that things you want to be cold start off cold. So you want to freeze your glasses to make sure as soon as you add liquid to the glass, it doesn't start immediately warming up. If there's ice in there, you want to make sure again, this hasn't started to melt, because as soon as you pour liquid over ice, it's going to start to dilute even further. And if that's wet ice, it's going to happen really quickly. So even controlling your dilution in the stirring or shaking process will be for nothing. And then finally, if you're making something that really needs to be as cold as possible, you can even freeze your spirits to give you as much time as you can to stir it down to the appropriate dilution with ice and get it as cold as possible, then served in a frozen glass. And then with those 3 tips, number 1, using high quality, consistent ice. Number 2, measuring your dilution. And number 3, being intentional with temperature, you're much more likely to get the drinks that you intend to serve. So now we've covered those 3 tips, we're going to move on to the next video in the series, which is going to be how to make clear ice.